The Shadows of the Pace Egg Play. In the quiet village of Midgley, nestled in the windswept hills of West Riding of Yorkshire, Good Friday was always a day of tradition. Every year since 1800, the schoolboys of Midgley donned makeshift costumes and performed the Pace Egg Play, a mumming spectacle rooted in the ancient tale of the history of the Seven Champions of Christendom. The name Pace Egg came from Pasche, an old word for Easter, tied to the custom of rewarding the young actors with painted eggs. For the villagers, it was a charming ritual, a thread of history woven into the fabric of their lives. But in 1994, the play took on a darker hue. Elliot Grayson, a 14-year-old with a mop of unruly brown hair, had been chosen to play Saint George, the heroic knight who slays the dragon in the tale. He'd practiced his lines for weeks, brandishing a wooden sword with pride as his classmates jeered and cheered. The performance was set for dusk on Good Friday, April 1st, in the shadow of the old stone church that loomed over Midgley's cobbled lanes. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with the last embers of sunset, as the boys gathered to begin. The play unfolded as it always had, raucous and clumsy, with St. George battling foes like the Turkish knight and the devil himself, while the fool capered about, collecting eggs from the crowd. But, as Elliot thrust his sword into the burlap-stuffed dragon and declared victory, a strange hush fell. The wind died, and the villagers' applause faltered. He felt it first, a prickling at the back of his neck, as if unseen eyes watched from the gathering dusk. Then they appeared. From the edges of the churchyard, shadowy figures emerged, their outlines flickering like candle flames. They wore archaic garb, tunics and cloaks from centuries past, and their faces were obscured by an unnatural haze. The boys froze, their painted wooden swords dangling limply. The villagers murmured, some backing away, others clutching their children. Elliot's friend Tom, playing the fool, whispered, "Elliot, do you see them?" Before he could answer, one figure stepped forward, a towering man with a broadsword strapped to his side, his form shimmering as if caught between worlds. His voice boomed, deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness. "Who dares summon the champions?" Elliot's mouth went dry. I'm just playing St. George," he stammered, clutching his prop sword. "It's the Pace Egg Play." The figure's eyes, glowing faintly beneath his hood, fixed on him. "The play is no mere game, boy. It is a call, a thread pulled from the tapestry of time. We are the Seven Champions, bound to this earth by the words you speak." The other shadows stirred. 6 more, each distinct. A knight with a lance, a figure cloaked in monkish robes, another bearing a bow. The villagers gasped as the air thickened with a strange energy, the scent of old earth and incense rising around them. Elliot's mind raced. He'd read about the history of the Seven Champions of Christendom in school, a 16th century legend of saints and warriors. Could the play, repeated for over 2 centuries, have woven some ancient magic into Midgley's soil? "What do you want?" Elliot asked, his voice trembling but firm. The lead champion tilted his head. "Each year your words stir us, but this time the call is stronger. A darkness lingers in your world, one we once fought. You, bearer of St. George's name, must finish what we began." Before Elliot could protest, the church bell tolled, a single mournful note that wasn't part of the tradition. The ground beneath the dragon prop split open, and a writhing, inky shape erupted forth. Not burlap and straw, but a living shadow with eyes like burning coals. The crowd screamed, scattering as the champions drew their weapons, their forms solidifying. "Stand with us!" the lead champion roared, tossing Elliot a shimmering blade that materialized from thin air. It was no prop. It was heavy, real, and thrummed with power. Heart pounding, Elliot raised it as the shadow dragon lunged. Champions fought beside him, their blades clashing with unearthly force, while the boys and villagers fled into the night. The battle was brief, but fierce. With a final thrust, guided by the champion's steady hand, Elliot pierced the creature's heart. It shrieked, dissolving into ash that scattered on the wind. Silence fell, broken only by his ragged breathing. The champions turned to him, their glow fading. "The darkness is banished," the leader said. "Your courage has freed us from this tether. The play must change, lest we return." With that, they vanished, leaving Elliot alone in the churchyard, the strange sword gone, his wooden one back in his hand. The villagers crept back, wide-eyed, whispering of miracles and ghosts. The pace egg play would never be the same, rewritten to avoid summoning the champions again. But as Elliot walked home, an egg from the fool's basket still clutched in his pocket, he felt a flicker of pride. For one night, he'd been more than a schoolboy. He'd been a champion of Christendom, and Midgley's quiet hills held a secret only he truly understood. The return of the flying serpent. The July sun blazed over Henham, Essex in 2024, casting long shadows across the fields where the annual Henham Fair buzzed with life. Stalls lined the village green, selling trinkets and treats. But the old tradition of model dragons, once a staple, until 1939, had long faded into memory. Still, the tale of the flying serpent lingered, etched into a 1669 pamphlet titled The Flying Serpent, or Strange News Out of Essex. It described a winged dragon, 9 feet long, with 2 rows of sharp white teeth and eyes the size of a sheep's, seen basking in a field near the village. Harmless, it vanished as mysteriously as it appeared, leaving behind a legacy of lore and a local beer dubbed Snakebite. Maeve Carter, a folklorist visiting from London, sipped a pint of snakebite at the Henham Arms, her notebook open to a sketch of the beast. She'd come to chase the story, drawn by its oddity and the fair's timing. The pamphlet rested in her bag, its brittle pages a treasure she'd tracked down in an archive. As dusk settled, she wandered to the field where the dragon had supposedly lounged centuries ago. Now, a quiet expanse of grass bordered by ancient oaks. The air was warm, thick with the scent of hay, when Maeve noticed a shimmer, like heat rising from pavement, rippling near the field's centre. She blinked, adjusting her glasses, and the shimmer sharpened into a shape. A creature, long and sinuous, uncoiled from the grass. 9 feet of gleaming scales caught the fading light, wings folded against its back, and its head lifted to reveal 2 rows of white teeth, glinting like daggers. Its eyes, large and lambent, locked onto hers. Maeve froze, her breath shallow. This was no trick of the mind. It was the flying serpent, alive and impossibly real. The pamphlet had called it harmless, but her pulse raced as it slithered closer, its wings twitching. She clutched her bag, the pamphlet inside suddenly heavy with meaning. "You're back," she whispered, more to herself than the beast. The dragon paused, tilting its head as if it understood. Then a voice, not heard but felt, deep and resonant in her bones, rolled through her mind. "The thread is pulled again." "What thread?" Maeve asked, voice trembling. "The memory," it replied, its eyes glowing brighter. "You carry it. You summon me." She glanced at the pamphlet peeking from her bag. Had her obsession, her research, called it forth? The dragon stretched its wings, each span shimmering with iridescent hues, and the air hummed with an electric charge. Maeve stumbled back as it rose, hovering a foot above the ground, its presence both majestic and terrifying. "I didn't mean to," she said. "What do you want?" To be known, it intoned. To bask once more. But the world has changed. Before she could respond, shouts echoed from the fair. A group of villagers, drawn by the strange light, approached the field. The dragon's head snapped toward them, and, with a flick of its tail, it shot upward, wings beating silently. It circled once, a shadow against the twilight, then vanished into the darkening sky, leaving only a faint ripple in the grass. Maeve's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees, the pamphlet slipping from her bag. The villagers reached her, babbling about the thing they'd seen. Like the old stories, one muttered, eyeing her with suspicion. She didn't argue. She knew the truth. Her delving into the past had tugged a thread across centuries, summoning the flying serpent back to Henham. The next day, the fair buzzed with rumours, and a few enterprising souls dusted off old moulds to crochet model dragons, selling them by noon. Snakebite flowed freely at the pub, and Maeve sat quietly, her notebook filled with frantic scribbles. She'd seen it, touched a legend, and though it was gone again, she felt its eyes linger in her dreams, vast and unblinking. The flying serpent hadn't harmed a soul, just as in 1669. But Maeve knew one thing for certain. She'd never taste snakebite the same way again. And Henham's quiet fields held a secret that refused to stay buried. But the Wraith of Harlow Wood. The evening of July 7th, 2014, was heavy with humidity as Daniel Carter, a road worker from Nottinghamshire, adjusted his hard hat and sighed. The job was simple. Realign the junction where the A60 met the B6020 near Harlow Wood. The old memorial stone, a weathered slab inscribed with Elizabeth Shepherd, d. July 7th, 1817, had to be shifted a few metres to accommodate the new layout. Locals had grumbled, muttering about curses and restless spirits, but Daniel dismissed it as superstition. He'd moved plenty of old markers before. This was just another Tuesday. Elizabeth Shepherd had been 17 when she met her end on that very spot, brutally slain by Charles Rotherham, a scissors grinder with a twisted mind. On her way to seek work in Mansfield, she'd crossed his path, and he'd mistaken her for a girl with coin. When he found her pockets empty, he tore a stake from the hedge and ended her life in a fit of rage. 10 days later, he was nabbed at the 3 Crowns Inn, trying to hawk her shoes and umbrella. Justice was swift. Hanged on Gallows Hill in Nottingham, his name faded into infamy. But Elizabeth, the tale said, never left. As Daniel's crew pried the stone from its roots with a crowbar, the air thickened. A faint mist curled around the trees of Harlow Wood, though the forecast had promised clear skies. The stone came free with a groan, and they hauled it to its new resting place. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow, ignoring the prickling unease creeping up his spine. That night, alone in his truck, after the crew had gone, Daniel lingered to finish paperwork. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m. when he heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on gravel. He glanced out the window, expecting a late-night wanderer, but the road was empty. Then a shadow flitted past, too quick to track. His breath hitched. The tapping grew louder, circling the truck. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam slicing through the dark, and there she was, standing by the relocated stone. A girl no older than 17 in a tattered dress, her dark hair plastered to a pale, bloodless face. Her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly and fixed on him. Elizabeth Shepherd. Daniel's mouth went dry. I didn't mean any harm, he stammered, though he wasn't sure why he spoke. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a trembling hand, pointing at the stone, and a voice, thin, cracked, and impossibly old, whispered through the night. "Put it back!" The air turned icy, and the truck's engine sputtered dead. Shadows twisted around her, forming jagged shapes, like stakes torn from a hedge. Daniel's heart hammered as she stepped closer, her bare feet leaving no mark on the gravel. He scrambled for his keys, but they slipped from his shaking hands. The tapping became a pounding, echoing inside his skull, and the windows fogged with her breath. Though she stood outside, panic seized him. "All right, I'll fix it," he shouted, voice breaking. The pounding stopped. Elizabeth's form flickered, her gaze softening, almost pleading. Then she was gone, the mist swallowing her whole. The truck roared back to life, and Daniel sat trembling until dawn crept over Harlow Wood. The next morning he returned with the crew, insisting they move the stone back to its original spot. His mates laughed, calling him spooked, but he didn't care. As they reset it, aligning it precisely where it had stood for over 2 centuries, a breeze rustled through the trees, warm, gentle, unlike the chill of the night before. Daniel swore he heard a faint sigh, a whisper of thanks carried on the wind. He never spoke of it again, but he avoided that stretch of the A60 after dark. Locals noticed the roadwork halted soon after, the junction left as it was, and when the mist rolls thick through Harlow Wood, some say they see her still. A girl in a tattered dress, guarding her stone, ensuring it stays where she fell. Charles Rotherham's greed took her life, but Elizabeth Shepherd's spirit claimed her place, unyielding as the oaks that watch over her restless haunt. Now the phantom riders of Goodrich. The mist clung to the ruins of Goodrich Castle like a shroud, softening the jagged edges of its 12th century stones. It was a damp evening in late autumn 2017 when Clara Henshaw, a local historian with a penchant for the supernatural, decided to visit the site. She'd heard the tales countless times, whispers of 2 lovers, Alice Birch and Charles Clifford, whose tragic end during the English Civil War had bound their spirits to this place. Clara carried a notebook, a flashlight, and a quiet hope that the stories were more than folklore. In 1646, Alice had defied her family, eloping with Charles, a dashing royalist soldier. Their love had led them to Goodrich Castle, where royalist allies sheltered them from the chaos of war. But fate turned cruel when Roundhead forces, led by Alice's own uncle, Colonel Birch, laid siege to the stronghold. Desperate to escape, the lovers fled toward the river Wye under cover of night. The currents were merciless, and their bodies were never found. Only whispers of their doom remained. Clara reached the castle's crumbling ramparts just as the moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light over the landscape. Below, the River Wye glimmered, its waters restless. She settled near the edge of the ruins, her flashlight dimmed, listening to the night. The air was still, save for the faint rush of the river, until a distant sound broke the silence, the rhythmic thud of hooves. Her breath caught as 2 figures emerged from the mist on the far bank. A horse, spectral and glowing faintly, carried 2 riders, a woman in a flowing gown and a man in a tattered cavalier cloak. Alice and Charles. Their forms shimmered, translucent yet vivid, their faces etched with determination and fear. The horse reared as it reached the river's edge, and then plunged into the water, its hooves kicking up ghostly spray. Clara watched, transfixed, as they rode toward her side of the Wye. Halfway across, the horse faltered, its legs thrashing as if caught in an unseen current. Alice's arms tightened around Charles, and their mouths opened in silent cries. The river seemed to rise against them, a dark force pulling them under. In an instant they vanished, swallowed by the mist, leaving only ripples on the water's surface. Heart pounding, Clara scribbled notes, her historian's mind racing. She'd seen them, the lovers of Goodrich, doomed to relive their fatal escape. But as she stood to leave, the hoofbeats returned, louder this time. She turned, and there they were again, closer now, galloping straight through the ruins toward her. The horse's eyes glowed like embers, and Alice's gaze locked onto Clara's, pleading. "Help us," a voice whispered, thin and cold, brushing past her ear. Clara stumbled back, her flashlight dropping. "How?" she gasped, though she wasn't sure they could hear her. Charles's spectral hand reached out, pointing toward the riverbank, where an ancient oak stood, gnarled and leaning. "The token!" his voice rasped. "Find it!" Before she could respond, they spurred the horse onward, racing through her and dissolving into the night. A chill lingered where they'd passed, and Clara's knees trembled. She retrieved her flashlight and hurried to the oak, its roots clawing into the earth. There, half buried in the soil, glinted a small, tarnished object, a silver ring, etched with a lover's knot. Her hands shook as she lifted it. Was this what they sought? A token of their bond, lost when they drowned? The air hummed with energy, and the hoofbeats echoed once more. Clara acted on instinct, sprinting to the river's edge and hurling the ring into the Wye. It arced through the mist, catching the moonlight, and sank with a soft splash. The mist swirled violently, and the lovers appeared again, this time on foot, standing on the water's surface. Alice clutched the ring to her chest, her face radiant with relief. Charles bowed his head to Clara, a faint smile breaking through his sorrow. "We are free," he murmured, his voice fading like a sigh. Together they turned, walking hand in hand across the river until they reached the far bank. There they dissolved into a soft light, leaving the night silent once more. Clara stood alone, the castle ruins dark and still behind her. The lovers of Goodrich had crossed at last, not on a phantom horse, but into peace. As she walked back to her car, Clara knew she'd uncovered more than history that night. She'd mended a centuries-old wound, and the River Wye would flow undisturbed, its ghostly riders finally at rest. Many thanks for treading this haunted tale's dark path. If its chill gripped you, like, follow, subscribe, and murmur your secrets below. Care to summon more? The coffee link below beckons. Heed its call.